Broadcasting from Boston, Massachusetts, the Smart Cities podcast is the only podcast dedicated to all things smart cities. The podcast is the creation of ARC Advisory Group's Smart City practice. ARC advises leading companies, municipalities, and governments on technology trends and market dynamics that affect their business and quality of life in their cities. To engage further, please like and share our podcast or reach out directly on Twitter at Smart City Viewpoints or on our website at www.arcweb.com/industries/smart-cities.
Welcome again to another episode of the Smart City Podcast. Today I'm thrilled to be joined by Denis of Runbrook here in Florida, West Palm Beach, actually.
That's correct.
Daniel, welcome. And
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Since our theme here at the ARC Forum is sustainability, we'll ask you to come here to talk about that. Can you give us a little bit background about yourself and how you came to this industry?
Absolutely. So I started working for design and construction when I was 16 years old. Sort of a very typical story that you hear where you start in the office rolling up plans, making coffee, sort of you're the office gopher, right? That was me for a while, and then I started college and I studied construction management and got a good base, sort of what does a construction project look like from the contractor side while concurrently working on the design side, right? And I think that sort of gives me a nice unique mix of educational and professional experience that helps me sort of speak the language of all the different players on the team, right? And so about 2008, 2010, we started seeing the green building movement really emerging, right? LEED was at the forefront of people's minds. A lot of people were getting their credentials. And so the firm that I was working with at the time, a mechanical engineering firm, was taking on these projects and didn't really know what they were getting into, right? It was sort of a new thing, and in some ways, they outkicked their coverage, right? And so I was the youngest guy in the office, and they said, "Hey, Danny, good luck, figure it out," right? And so, I hit the ground running, and somewhere along the line, I fell in love with it, right? And today, what I feel is so rewarding about what we do is that we're able to do well and do good, right? And that's something that that motto, do well and do good, is something that I try to instill in our team. Do well for yourself, obviously, right? But do good for your community, the environment, those around you, right? And if you can do those two things, you'll in your workplace, you'll live a fulfilling life, in my opinion, right? And so that's something that we try to champion over at Runbrook. And so shortly after sort of falling in love with green building at the mechanical engineering firm, I sort of switched over to do sustainability full time. And I did that for about 8 years as a consultant. And about 18 months ago, I was recruited to join Runbrook as their president. And so I'm very blessed to be here today and talk your ear off about green building.
That's great. So can you scope out and describe, what is sustainability engineering? What's the breadth of it?
Yeah.
What kind of things are important today?
Great question. So the way that I describe what we do is we help project teams of owners, developers, architects, engineers, and various other stakeholders in the pursuit of some form of green building certification. How do we walk them through the design and construction process to make their buildings more energy and water efficient using better products that provide better indoor air quality for occupants and things like that, right? And so we're on board on a project basically from start to finish, right? A lot of times our clients will ask, well, when do you want to be engaged? I say as early as you'll have me, because if we can start on passive measures that don't necessarily require any additional funding, that will set us up for success, right? And so we try to be part of the process from early on. So it's a lot of hand-holding, right? In some ways, I like to think of myself as a kindergarten teacher, where sometimes I've gotta explain these concepts in sort of very basic terms and walk people through it, because sustainability is not always at the forefront of everybody's minds, right? Especially when in the design and construction industry, everything is, I need it yesterday. right? And a lot of times people fall back
True.
into sort of old habits and what they always do. Like I can't begin to tell you how many times I've heard, but Danny, I've been doing it this way for 40 years.
Indeed. So Danny, you mentioned stakeholders. So that when I think of stakeholders, I'm a systems engineer, and I think that this is a much more structured process than being that kindergarten teacher. Where does it start, and who are these stakeholders? How do you find them? What's a stakeholder? What's a stakeholder community?
Yeah, so most of our clients are architects or developers, but we try to be mindful of the occupant, the end user, even the management company. And that's what we mean by stakeholders. Who has their hand in this project in one way or another? How can we address their wants and needs, right? And so most of our clients, like I said, are architects and or developers. I sometimes joke that 90% of our clients don't want to be our clients, right? That they are because they have to be, right?
Oh, that's great.
And so whether it's some form of municipal requirement, or in South Florida specifically, we have various municipalities that require some form of green building certification if your project is greater than X amount of square feet. Sort of depends on each municipality. Or there's a funding arm where maybe you're getting some government funding and the government's saying, hey, you got to make this thing sustainable. And so that's where we come in. Don't get me wrong, there are some clients out there that they make sustainability a part of their mission statement. And it's very refreshing to work with those people. But most of the time it's, hey, I don't know what this is. Walk me through it. And that's where the kindergarten teacher analogy comes from.
So help me with this. Sustainability, I mean, some of us default just to energy efficiency and energy conservation.
Right.
But I know you've mentioned in the past water and other aspects. What other type of things does sustainability engineering touch?
That's a great question. So one of the things that's often overlooked in what we do, I think, is indoor environmental quality. Selecting materials that don't off-gas and don't give nasty chemicals and VOCs to the occupants over time. Ventilation, having air changes in your home or building is something that's often overlooked, and people don't really think about it. And it's not, so there are some conspicuous green features, like you go into a hotel that has waterless urinals and you can see that there's no plumbing to them, so it's conspicuous, right? You see solar panels on the side of a building, oh, okay. But the ventilation, the indoor air quality, the attention to source control, making sure that those materials that you've selected are environmentally friendly and don't off-gas, that stuff is not really obvious, but it's so important. And it makes up a huge part of what we do.
True. And perhaps you can even comment on something as simple as if you have a very tightly sealed building, air quality may degrade from, say, CO2 and different...
Right. And for years, we've been building our buildings tighter and tighter. And in fact, most of the building codes encourage tight construction. And that's in direct conflict with indoor air quality, right? Because we used to bank on infiltration to be our air change, to be our ventilation. Now we're building tighter and tighter, and so there is very little air change. And so you get stagnant air and you get sick building syndrome, right? And so the solution there is to provide some form of mechanical ventilation, some sort of outside air. Some people like to use the term fresh air. I don't necessarily like using that because it depends who's next door. It might not be so fresh.
Exactly. And of course, that's not a trivial engineering endeavor, because you do have the heat exchange issues,
right,
as well.
Absolutely, and sort of that's where you start to see that some of the things that we do in green building, sometimes they conflict with some of the other missions that we have, right? Ventilation is a good example where in our climate in South Florida, the hot, humid climate, introduction of more outside air is in direct conflict with our pursuit of energy savings, right? Your AC's got to work harder to remove that humidity and cool that air, right?
Absolutely.
But there's a trade-off there, and we believe, and I think the industry is pretty much, there's consensus that indoor air quality is important. I think sometimes we lose sight of the forest for the trees, and we're talking only about energy efficiency, and we forget that our mission first and foremost should be not to hurt our occupants, right? Make sure that their indoor air quality, their building works for them. And so, you know,
absolutely. In fact, I think you and I will probably go even further, that we want to enhance the the productivity of the worker in the
Yes.
building, so that their desktop is adequately lit, not overlit, not underlit, so that the oxygen content of the air is of a point where someone can be effective at their job.
Yeah, no, you make a great point. So there's case studies out there that show that people with access to quality views have less absenteeism and greater productivity in the workplace. People that are able to bike to work and see foliage on their way to work or through their window are more productive, and that's not just good for the occupant, that's good for business.
No, exactly, and very often we just do not really take those somewhat softer factors into account.
Right.
There's one anecdotal story that there is a bit of scientific research about this that concerns me. That when you board an airliner and the air conditioner is not running, there's a buildup of CO2. And did you ever wonder why you get sleepy when you board an aircraft? It's because of poor air quality in the aircraft before they start up the ventilation system. Well, Daniel, what are not the world isn't all rosy, and not everyone is just embracing sustainability engineering.
Sure.
So what obstacles do we have? And what obstacles? Let's start with that.
Yeah. So, a lot of times we're brought on board on a project, and at times we can be seen as sort of a contentious figure, right? Going back to that phrase that I've heard quite a bit of. But Danny, I've been doing this for 40 years, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean you've been doing it right, right? And so sometimes we have to have those difficult conversations where, hey, I know that you've been doing it this way, and you're sort of set in your ways, but let's try to reinvent the wheel a little bit here. Let's try to think a little bit differently, think outside the box. How can we, ultimately, you've got to do this thing, right? So how do we get there, right? I think the biggest obstacle we face is just resistance within the project team, right? Not everyone is bought in. Not everyone necessarily wants to do it. And so sometimes we've got to herd cats and and get people on board. And also sort of more specific to our climate is just, it's a hot, humid climate. And to show energy savings is really tough. It can be very difficult for us to show a significant amount of energy savings on South Florida.
What about the stakeholder engagement and actual consensus of the stakeholders? Not only does humidity conflict with energy savings in our environment, but with all your different stakeholders, they might have competing interests too.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I tend to find that once people are in the building and come to understand why we implemented these systems or selected these materials, they tend to come around, right? The resistance is always in the immediate. It's like a knee-jerk reaction of, whoa, I don't do it this way. I've never bought that product. Mm-hmm. But then you go and you revisit them maybe a year at post-occupancy, and you speak to the management company, and they say, you know what, this actually worked out great. I'll give you an example. One of the services that are required when you're pursuing a lead building is building commissioning.
Sure.
And commissioning is essentially a third-party review of the energy-consuming systems in the building to make sure that they're operating the way that the designer intended and meeting the owner's project requirements, right? Commissioning can add tremendous value, and it can reduce callbacks and maintenance issues and things like that. And so in the beginning, the owner might say, wow, this is an expensive service and I've never done this before. But then you visit them 5 years later and they said, hey, I've got another building that we built exactly the same down the street, and I've got maintenance issues every single week.
Sure.
But the one that you guys commissioned, you caught all the sort of little problem areas early, and my machines are running smoothly, and I've reduced my maintenance costs, right? And so that's something that if you don't have the foresight to really think about how that might add value, you may not gain that added value.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, commissioning is it's a complex system. It requires commissioning,
Sure.
and the granularity of all those little pieces.
Right.
is extreme. Even balancing the VIV controllers in each room of, of a larger building is a big deal.
Right. Sometimes even the smallest thing, like labeling of your condenser water piping or your chilled water piping. If the maintenance guy comes in and he doesn't know which one's supply and which one's return, how's he going to repair the system, right? And so sometimes it's as primitive as that. Sometimes it's very technical, but it's. I mean, I could talk about this all day.
I see. So, Danny, what do we see for the future of sustainability engineering?
I think we're going to see we're going to move away from energy savings as our big metric for energy performance to carbon reduction, decarbonization. I think that's going to be the next wave. We're not going to look at, okay, you're saving X amount of dollars anymore. We're talking about, okay, how much carbon what's your carbon reduction? Can you have embodied removal of carbon in your materials? That kind of stuff. That's sort of way out there kind of thinking. And I think indoor air quality and occupant comfort will continue to be at the forefront of what we do. I think it's going to be sort of emerging technologies like solar. Even I just recently learned about a product called hydro panels, which essentially remove moisture from the air and provide potable water for occupants. And so it's that
Beautiful.
kind of sort of what maybe 10 years ago you thought was what maybe that you thought was pie in the sky is now going to be very prevalent, I think.
That's great. Well, Danny, we're just about out of time. Do you have any last-minute comments for our audience?
Yeah, I just want to take this opportunity to plug Runbrook. Please visit our website at runbrook.com. If you need anything from me and you want someone to talk your ear off about sustainability, you can reach me at D as in Daniel, and then my last name, Denis, Denis, at runbrook.com. And I really appreciate you having me here today.
Thanks, Danny. You beat me to my last question, which is usually please share your contact information.
Well, there it is.
Thank you very much for
you.
that. And I thank you to our audience again, and we look forward to seeing you on another edition of the Smart City Podcast.
Broadcasting from Boston, Massachusetts, the Smart Cities Podcast is the only podcast dedicated to all things smart cities. The podcast is the creation of ARC Advisory Group's Smart City practice. ARC advises leading companies, municipalities, and governments on technology trends and market dynamics that affect their business and quality of life in their cities. To engage further, please like and share our podcast or reach out directly on Twitter at Smart City Viewpoints or on our website at www.arcweb.com/industries/smart-cities.